Hello everyone and welcome to Macquarie University's MBA Information Webinar and Masterclass. My name is Sienna and I'm a very proud student at Macquarie University, but I'm also a staff member. Now before we get into things, I'm just going to give it 30 seconds to wait for everyone to join the meeting and then we'll get underway. Thank you. Alrighty. Thank you again for joining us for the MBA Information Webinar and Masterclass that we are hosting this evening. We really appreciate your attendance. Virtually, we love that you're streaming in. Now, just to start our proceedings, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and I extend that respect to other Indigenous guests present with us today. Okay, now for those of you who didn't hear, my name is Sienna. I'm a business student at Macquarie University as well as a staff member. I'm going to be today's mediator. Okay, now I'm joined by three people, which you may be able to see. Firstly, Steve Jaynes. He is the director of the MBA program at Macquarie University. Secondly, Jaco Lok, who is the Professor of Strategy within the Macquarie Business School. And then thirdly is Bill Hovey, who is the CEO and president of Arande, and he's actually an alumni of the MBA here at Macquarie University. Now, just to give you a format and timeline of how today is going to work, I'm going to start with an opening presentation about the MBA and what it's like to study the MBA here with us at Macquarie University. And that's going to be run by Steve Jaynes, who once again is the director of the MBA program here at Macquarie University. Then we'll move on to a masterclass in resilience now and beyond COVID-19, and that's going to be run by Jaco Lok. Okay, and then from there we're going to go to Bill Hovey, who's going to give us some alumni insights. Once again, he did study the MBA here at Macquarie University, so he's going to have some wonderful insights for those of you streaming in. And then to finish up, we will have a Q&A session. So submit your questions in the Q&A function on the Zoom panel. We will do our best to answer all of those questions at the end, but if we don't get to you today, we will follow up. So no need to worry, we'll do our best though. Now, just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have those questions, please submit them, okay? We can't answer your questions if you don't submit them, okay? Now, without further ado, I'm gonna pass over to Steve. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and I'll see you soon for the Q&A.
Thank you, Sienna, and welcome again to the MBA Information Session and Masterclass. Thanks for making the time to join us. And as you can see on the slide, yes, you can transform your career, and quite possibly you might do so even before Donald Trump concedes defeat, given how quiet he has been of late. So we do live in uncertain times. So I think education, further education, as you're now considering clearly by being here in this session, is a key to that. So I'll just talk about the overall program and focus on some particular developments underway in the Macquarie MBA, which will be rolled out in 2021, so perfect timing for you. I've got a number of points to cover here. And you'll know, looking at these lists of points here in terms of why the Macquarie MBA, you're already probably across a number of these key points, but let's not forget the fundamentals of business and of leadership. And at the Macquarie MBA, we very much focus on those key business disciplines to build your business acumen. We have a growing focus on sustainability and ESG, environment, social and governance in our program, and on building your leadership capability. So we are developing a leadership and career program which is integrated in the Macquarie MBA. So you'll experience that firsthand, integrated with your units that you'll study. So really, in terms of an MBA and the Macquarie MBA in particular, and we've got Jaco coming up shortly to talk strategy. He is a leader of our strategic management unit. Developing a strategic thinking, communication and decision-making skills is what we focus on, working with you in terms of at the intersection of your knowledge, your work experience, industry experience with our models, tools and frameworks and our practice-led academics. So it's there, that intersection where the value lies in the Macquarie MBA. It's really also about widening your network. And so you will be working with a range of middle to senior managers. And we've got Bill coming up later as an alumni to exemplify that sort of experience, that senior leadership experience. So widening your network is a key dimension of the Macquarie MBA. I mentioned the career program that we're building in, and that really will help you, whether you want to stay within your current industry or to move across industry. It helps you in either of those endeavors. And so we are building that career development program right at your entry level in terms of a foundation unit, then at a mid stage, and then at an end stage. And then we want to keep in touch with you as you move through from student to alumni. We do offer an increasingly flexible MBA program. This has been driven partly by COVID-19 and our shift to online delivery, which I think we've managed very well. I'm fairly new at Macquarie. I started in January, so I've come into this real time of change as we've shifted online in the meantime and as we've gradually returned to face-to-face delivery. But it's that flexibility of different modes that helps you fit in with your work style, your lifestyle, and your commitments. We're AA CSB accredited. We are well ranked in terms of the Financial Times, The Economist, and most recently in the QS career ranking for outcomes in finance, entrepreneurship, marketing, consulting. We sit inside the top 100 of business schools around the world on those rankings there. So a strong program. And really for you, it's as you consider moving to a more senior leadership role, you may be looking to become a company director, to work in consulting, or even to start your own business. So there's a range of outcomes and goals you can achieve in the Macquarie MBA. As I said before, it's that network that you'll be working in and the connections that you build through the program. I've been involved in the MBA world for some 15 or 20 years at Melbourne, and now this year in Sydney at Macquarie. And that's an enduring theme, is the connections you build and that network you build, and oftentimes opportunities coming through your program in terms of work, seeing what's happening in other industries, seeing how people are leading in their styles and the way that they practice, and learning from others. So your fellow student typically is aged around 37 with about 8 years managerial experience from across a range of industries, public sector and private sector. We've got a strong international program, number of students from around the world. So you'll get that mix of industry sectors, you'll get that global alumni network that does provide that lifelong learning opportunity. And I think it's, as you work through the program and you realize your sense of your own purpose, as you build your business acumen across our business disciplines, you will see other opportunities that may make a better fit for you in terms of where you want to go career-wise. So that's a key part with the Macquarie MBA. In terms of the course itself, I do want to mention a couple of key changes that we are rolling out in 2021. So perfect timing for you. One in particular is a shift to a 12-unit Macquarie MBA. So that's a 1.5 year duration. It's about a $60,000 price there for the MBA. So it's a more competitive offering we are working there on in terms of the MBA program. And that requires, though, in terms of your admission, it requires you have 5 years managerial and professional work experience, which typically will probably go to most of you here in this session. I suspect that you probably already have that sort of experience. This is the post-experience degree. So that's a 12-unit MBA course. There's also the 16-unit MBA if you are seeking a longer program that might work for you if you're a international student. And that would be required if you only have the 3 years managerial professional experience. So in terms of some what I see as very exciting and strong developments in our MBA, we're bringing in a leadership practice and development unit. That's where we're going to locate career coaching and mentorship. That's at a mid stage. At the early stage in the MBA and our managing people organizational behavior unit is where we'll first work with you on your career development and career goal setting. Then again, as I said, in the leadership practice unit, which we're developing at our sort of the mid stage of the MBA, that's very much focusing on yourself in terms of diagnosing your own strengths and advantages and your weaknesses and gaps as a leader, and then reviewing those and developing those. We're bringing in a data and business analytics unit as well as a digital strategy unit. So that's clearly a structural change in industry, which we are reflecting in our MBA through a digital strategy unit. And then also an MBA capstone project. And after my short spiel here, I will pass you over to Jaco, and he will be involved with the capstone unit. And that is a truly integrative capstone, as you would expect in any strong MBA, which brings together the various business disciplines across finance, accounting, marketing, strategy, leadership, and it's project-based and applied. So that's a really strong way to bring everything together toward the end of your MBA program. And that's also where we're going to locate career and leadership development activity for you as you've sort of navigated your way through the Macquarie MBA and come to the end. We then want to reflect with you on your career stage as you complete the MBA, and then also build that relationship with you as you go from student to alumni. Just also to point out the pathways. So you can come in with a graduate certificate, which comprises 4 foundation units, and you can access that pathway without a previous bachelor's degree. What I've mentioned above there in terms of the full 12 or 16 unit MBA degree does require the bachelor's as a prerequisite. So the graduate certificate enables you to come in without that, but with the managerial and professional experience, and give you a grounding across the key business disciplines of managing people, accounting, economics, and marketing. And then through to a diploma, which includes those 4 foundation units, and then leadership practice, finance, business strategy, negotiation, or big data and decision making. So those are just the ways that you can articulate through and through to the MBA, or you can enroll straight into the MBA program. So we have that sort of flexibility. Also, just want to talk briefly about our study modes, because I think one of the key things that I'm guessing you are looking for is flexibility in an MBA program to fit in with you, to fit in with your work, family commitments that you have. So we are now offering a more flexible program as we have shifted to online, driven by necessity, of course. But that's actually been a great opportunity for us to harness the technologies to deliver our MBA program online in a range of flexible ways, using synchronous live interaction as we're doing now, and asynchronous delivery, so recorded lecture content, video content, that sort of thing. So we've got the online mode, which is, we're still very much in that mode as we work our way through and hopefully out of COVID-19. Good news today with the Pfizer vaccine. Let's hope that keeps coming through. We have the block mode, which is, I think, a great way to build that cohort experience, to work with your fellow students in weekend study over 5 days, over 2 weekends within a term. And you can see that on the right-hand side, that typical sort of progress and sequence with pre-reading, activity, then a weekend of lectures where you really get to work with your fellow students, work in groups and syndicates, get to know your lecturer and guest speakers as they're used, and then assignment work, projects in between that, and then another weekend of study following that. And then there's the typical weekly classes mode, and that might suit with you if you're, for example, located near the city in the CBD, or if you're located out at North Ryde campus for classes there weekly or in the evening. So I think that flexibility is important. I've just got a note there on the slide in terms of your overall commitment per unit. Roughly speaking, it's about 150 hours, made up of about 40 hours in the class, give or take, an additional 8 or 12 hours per week of individual and group work. So that's your typical commitment there. So of course, you're typically busy, possibly with a young family. That's the typical demographic, and so that flexibility is important, and also, you know, the study load, the workload that works for you as you go through the MBA. We do, of course, provide a supportive network in terms of student services, regular assistance and advice, orientation days, support, various workshops. As I mentioned before, we are building very much our career development and resources. We have a dedicated MBA career manager who will work with you through the program and through a variety of workshops and tools to help you reflect on your career, and in particular, just to understand how the MBA is repositioning you for your future career, maybe opening up different doors, and you might be realizing a different pathway in terms of where you want to go. So a variety of facilities. There are a wonderful campus in North Ryde, and of course we also have the CBD campus as well. So that's really a quick run through of the Macquarie MBA program, including some key developments that we are implementing in 2021. And I'm thinking that you'll be well positioned to benefit from those developments. And I look forward to meeting with you. I do hope you continue to make the right choice in terms of the Macquarie MBA, and I'll get to meet with you at some stage. Like Jaco, I also teach in the strategy program. My area is around strategy, change management, and culture. So we might get to work together on the strategy unit. So that's really my introduction to the MBA at Macquarie, and I'll just stop sharing my screen. There will be a Q&A coming up toward the end, but at this stage, I'd like to hand over to you, Jaco, for your masterclass. Thanks, Jaco.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us in this webinar. I'm excited to share with you some of my latest thinking on an important topic, increasingly important topic. One of the reasons I'd like to share it is also to kind of show you how we can bring research to life in the classroom. So how we can actually make research practical. So that's what I'll try and do on the topic of resilience, which is a complex topic on which not a lot of research has been done on organizations, surprisingly, perhaps. Sorry, my screen is stuck. Hold on. Apologies. There we are. Okay. Apologies. Right. Why resilience? Well, should be rather obvious to most of us, actually. In the era of COVID, what we've seen is actually massive differences between countries and their responses to COVID. Some countries showing themselves to be much more resilient to a crisis like that than others. In the US, we've now even seen at the societal level democracy itself being stretched and tested, and fortunately showing some resilience in the US. At the organizational level, we've seen a number of bankruptcies such as Virgin and Sea Folly. And of course, at the individual psychological level, we are now seeing lots of people losing their jobs, also struggling perhaps with quarantine and isolation. And so resilience is really a topic that is relevant across these different levels: societal, organizational, psychological. Before we get into my thinking on this topic, of course, it helps to define what we're talking about. And resilience has actually been studied across a number of fields. It started in the 19th century in material science. And the definition there is to absorb energy when so the capacity of a material to absorb energy when elastically deformed without creating a permanent deformation. So it's the ability to absorb energy when under stress. And in ecology, it's defined as an ecosystem to the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance and reorganize to retain its function. Similarly, in psychology, the process of adapting well in the face of adversity. And finally, in organization theory, the maintenance of positive adjustment under challenging conditions. So I'd like to summarize that as I've done in the title here. So basically, resilience is the ability to absorb and adapt to adverse conditions. And so the question is, an interesting question that I've been thinking about, is what is it that can explain some of these differences in resilience at the societal level to, for example, the COVID crisis? What is it that can explain differences in resilience at the corporate level? Virgin going bankrupt, Qantas still being there. But also on the individual level, what makes some people psychologically more resilient than others? Now, these are all big questions and not easy to answer, but what I'd like to do is to basically share you my insights in my attempt to basically develop a theory that would be relevant across these different levels. And later on, I'll show you some examples of how that could work. Based on my research across these different fields, ecology, biology, and engineering, as well as psychology, as well as organization theory, I have identified 4 factors across them that are critical for human resilience. The first is what I call preparedness, the second, acceptance, third, control, and the fourth, resourcefulness. Now, what do we mean by these 4 things? I'll break them out here through some examples. So what is preparedness? Well, lots of research has shown that those organizations or individuals who are somewhat prepared, who have actually been through the experience of similar crises before, tend to be more resilient in their response to a new crisis. Here, it's important to realize that resilience isn't something like your response to something that you can easily predict. It's actually your response to something, an unpredictable type of crisis, an unpredictable adversity. And people in organizations and even countries clearly respond differently. And so preparedness is about how prepared are you in terms of your experience and mindset to take on such adversity. And I can break that down into 2 sub-factors. One is, as you've seen in the difference between Qantas and Virgin, is that what we call slack is, of course, important. Qantas had a lot of cash sitting on its balance sheet, and Virgin was highly leveraged. And so the difference was clear. Virgin couldn't handle the COVID crisis, and Qantas can. In fact, it can still survive without any flights until December 21, given the cash reserves it had already built up. But that also applies to individual levels. So if you are, for example, predisposed to depression, or you have other vulnerabilities, then you are more in the space of precariousness, just like Virgin was, rather than having a slack buffer through which you can absorb adversity. So that's slack versus precariousness. And then we get on the right, we get to learning versus ignorance. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the Formula One race car there, it is designed for when it crashes for things to fly off. And the reason for that is that absorbs a lot of the impact so that the core is protected. And so the reason why these crashes look so bad is it's actually by design. And of course, that design is through experience over time. So rather than this kind of she'll be right thinking, it's actually paying careful attention to what does and what doesn't work, what has and hasn't worked. And so again, learning through experience. Interestingly, a Formula One car engine actually is quite precarious if we look on the left. So there's not a lot of slack because it's so finely tuned for optimum performance. And so there is a paradox there. If you finely tune for optimal performance, so such as, for example, Virgin being highly leveraged, of course, risk goes up and your ability to respond to a crisis decreases. Second, we have what I call acceptance, which is about accepting reality, so being realistic about facing adversity. And that is surprisingly difficult for a lot of people. As we've seen in the case of the US, and Trump, of course, is a good example of that, basically being in denial about the reality of the problem to the point of engaging in magical thinking that it will just automatically go away. So it's an acceptance of reality, but then it's also the self-compassion or shared compassion to feel okay in that adversity, to feel okay about feeling overwhelmed or bad. And so there's a lot of research now in psychology that has shown that self-compassion is hugely important for resilience and well-being, to the point where children are now, in terms of raising children, the advice now is to allow them to express their emotions and to learn to be comfortable with them, even including negative ones, because it's that comfort and being okay with negative emotions that actually makes people more resilient, perhaps counterintuitively. Less resilient people or countries or organizations are actually characterized by self-blame or blame culture. And so we've seen Trump do this as well. So we're trying to deflect and blame, well, in this case, China. The third factor, control, which is a notion, again, taken from psychology that has shown that what's known as self-efficacy, which is your belief in your abilities to actually be able to act and make a difference on whatever it is that you're facing, is, again, very important for resilience. That is a degree of composure, rather than allowing yourself to be overwhelmed, for example, by catastrophizing in terms of the crisis taking over everything, your whole life, for example, or a whole organization, and thinking that the crisis is going to last forever. It's permanent. So these terms are known as pervasiveness and permanence in psychology. And so, again, people and organizations that are prepared, but also have the confidence to act rather than becoming blindsided and paralyzed, tend to be more resilient. And finally, resourcefulness, which is about meaning making. And you go, well, why meaning making? Well, when faced with adversity, it can be existentially challenging, and it has been. COVID has been for a lot of people and a lot of organizations, and it can be extremely disorienting as well. And so research has shown that in those situations, when facing adversity, interpersonal support networks are massively important for increased resilience. And what needs to happen in those interpersonal networks is to try and make sense of this crisis, this adversity that you're facing together, rather than in a fragmented, isolated way, trying to struggle through on an individual basis. So this idea of collective meaning, and usually there has to be a solid core of values that are driving this. So if you look at the pictures, for example, here, we've got a recovering forest after a forest fire in Australia, and we've got coral bleaching, irrecoverable. So if we think about the difference between these two, the trees, their core has still been protected. That allows them to then regenerate, even though around the surface, the tree is completely destroyed. That buffer is not available to coral reefs, which the core itself gets immediately harmed through raising water temperatures and permanently damaged. And so there's quite a lot of research to show that, in times of crisis, in times of adversity, values become extremely important as a foundation to then begin improvising, creating new meanings, and regenerating. So those are the four factors. Now, I'd like to bring those to life by sharing some research with you. My colleagues in Cambridge and we did a big study on PTSD in war surgeons in Afghanistan. And we were actually surprised to find that the PTSD rates in war surgeons are as high as frontline soldiers, even though war surgeons don't operate at the front, so their lives is not under direct threat. They tend to be battle hardened, so they have had multiple tours of duty, and they're not put off by the graphic injuries that they have to deal with. In fact, sometimes they compete over what to us looks like the most gruesome cases, to them the most challenging and most worthwhile. And so why then are PTSD rates so high? If you look at our paper, we've got a full explanation, but if we now look at these resilience factors, we can already start making some sense of it. So if we look at preparedness, the way war surgeons are prepared is through training, but the training is strictly technical. In fact, their culture is there's nothing but technical. This is the direct quote from one of the war surgeons in Afghanistan. There is nothing but technical, which means that they're not prepared through training or experience for the psychological challenges of being in a war, living through in a war zone. And so the preparedness is, let's say, incomplete. When it comes to acceptance of psychological issues, struggles, it's generally seen as a weakness. The organizational culture of both medicine and the military sees it as a weakness and as an individual problem rather than an organizational issue. Because the military, for example, can argue, well, look, even if PTSD rates are as high as 20%, 25%, that means 1 in 4 is affected, but 3 in 4 aren't. So there must be something about these people, there's 1 in 4, that makes them more prone to PTSD. And therefore, it's not necessarily our issue, it's an individual issue. And so you can see there's a type of denial going on there, which makes for a less resilient environment. When it comes to control, we found that a lot of war surgeons are overwhelmed by a sense of futility. So they come there to make a difference, and they realize slowly that they can't really, and the victims keep coming, and the war is never ending, and they can't do anything about the war anyway. And it's particularly when children are presented to them that they tended to struggle with feelings of futility and senselessness. And so there is a lack of a feeling of being in control of the situation. It's rather the opposite. And finally, resourcefulness. Well, there were no collective means for coping with psychological distress because it was countercultural to do so. And so coping strategies, the resourcefulness was actually on an individual basis. So individual war surgeons would be quite inventive. For example, one would grow tomato plants behind the tent in the desert to have a sense of creating something as a coping strategy amidst all of the destruction of war. Other surgeons basically asked people to text them during repatriation services when fallen soldiers are basically taken into planes to be flown home. You're expected to show up and pay your respects, but that was quite painful to a lot of war surgeons, so they would set up text messages so that they'd be called back for an emergency to avoid the distress of needing to witness repatriation of fallen soldiers. And so the resourcefulness was on a kind of fragmented individual basis rather than a collective basis. And the overall effect was that slowly there was a sense of meaninglessness. So their value base was eroded. In war studies, we now have something, in addition to PTSD, there's something called moral injury, which I think is, in this case particularly, is more appropriate, really, moral injury. So the chipping away at your own moral foundations and finding them actually quite empty and brittle and having nothing to replace them with. And so if we look at the resilience factors, we can begin to see that the conditions for resilience are not there, even though on the surface they are actually quite tough and resilient and are trained to deal with these very, very difficult circumstances. Yet deeper down, they are traumatized. At least many of them are, at least one in 4, but most would be suffering from some type of trauma thereafter. So obviously this ought to have implications for how we organize ourselves, how we manage our organizations, not just in these extreme cases. We can actually learn from these extreme cases and bring them into our everyday lives. If we look at COVID-19, now, by the way, I must stress here that, this is my latest theoretical thinking. Of course, there's a saying, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. And so I hope that's the case here. But this is not based on empirical research yet. So it's basically the latest thinking. But if you look at the latest thinking, if we look at these resilience factors that I've identified, and you look at 2 countries in terms of their response, you see big differences in the resilience factors being present or not, and possibly as a result, huge differences in the number of deaths per 1 million population, which you see at the bottom. So just briefly, a lot of the US healthcare system was actually in a quite precarious footing, so not a lot of slack built in. Whereas Taiwan did have a slack in its healthcare system. Taiwan had dealt with SARS before, and so had all the not just the protocols ready, but actually experience with dealing with a pandemic or a virus like COVID. Whereas in the US, there was generally a sense of denial and ignorance. There were plans available, but those plans weren't necessarily tested at all. There was very little practice with them. Then, of course, we get to the realism. So Taiwan was realistic that this was a real problem. And as we've seen with Trump, there was a lot of denial that this was a real problem. A lot of compassion was shown, you know, both here in Australia, which is done relatively well as well. Whereas in America, we quickly get into a blame culture. Who's to blame for this? Rather than who's suffering and how do we care for them? When it comes to control, Taiwan was confident that it could handle this, and its population was as well. Whereas if you look at the US, there was quickly a sense of the country being overwhelmed, not really being able to do much about it, despite experts saying, actually, you can do something about it. The overall attitude seems to be one of helplessness. Like, this is just a fait accompli. There's nothing much we can do about this. And then finally, resourcefulness. Well, Taiwanese society has some core values. There's a saying in Taiwan, which is, you know, this is your country, so you're the one who has to save it. And so there's this sense of individual and collective responsibility. And whereas if we see it in the US, there's lots of discussion. Is it the economy? Is it health? What values do we actually prefer? Is it individual freedom, or is it freedom from a virus? And so we see huge fragmentation in value prioritization across the different states, and no organized collective response at all, which means that improvisation is ad hoc. And in the case of the US, when it came to developing test kits, they followed the rigid system, which actually produced faulty kits, when in Asia, they had already developed testing kits very quickly through improvisation, by getting companies together and to act collectively under the instruction of government. They were able to produce test kits much, much faster than in the US. So, you know, anecdotally, there might be something in this in terms of resilience factors being important, not just at the individual level, organizational level, but perhaps even at the societal level. So to close off, what does this mean for you if you are leading an organization or you're a manager? Well, I believe what this means is we ought to be able to create the conditions in organizations for resilience, to be able to cope with adversity, crises like COVID, but there can be many others. First is through preparedness. Encourage intelligent wariness. What do I mean with intelligent wariness? Well, wariness is not being too comfortable with your own success. Just because you haven't had a crisis for 5 years doesn't mean you can't have one tomorrow. And so wariness is something different from panic or anxiety. It's an intelligent wariness. So it's basically never really being comfortable and being aware that crises can happen, and building in slack. So having some kind of buffer, be it financial or in terms of people, that allow you to at least absorb the initial shock. In terms of acceptance, I think we need to try and create a culture of realism rather than denial, and of compassion. And both are actually quite tricky in a lot of organizations. Sometimes there's not a lot of realism going on in organizations when it comes to, for example, their performance or what crises they're facing. And compassion seems to be a completely new term in management. And so we'll need to do some more thinking about what a culture like that could look like and how you could build one. Then in terms of control, well, I think as managers, as leaders, during crises, we need to remind people that they will get through this, and what they do matters. So this belief in their own ability to act and make a difference in the times of crisis is extremely important. And I think leaders can help with this. And finally, resourcefulness. I think this is about empowerment, empowering local solutions, but from a basis of very clear values. And again, values is where a lot of organizations struggle. A lot of organizations, of course, have value statements, but to the extent to which those values are necessarily lived is quite mixed. And so we need to do more work, I think, as organizations to be clear and to actually live on those values. And then in times of crisis, leverage those values to allow people to regenerate the organization and improvise their way to a new way of being and acting in the world, for example, post-COVID. So I hope through this presentation that you're getting a sense of, what type of research is being done in management studies and how it can be made practical in terms of managerial implications. Happy to take questions later on if you have any. For now, thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Jaco, for that presentation. It's incredibly insightful listening to you, so thank you. Now, for our third presentation of today, I'm going to pass over to Bill Hovey, who is now CEO and President of Verunde. Now, Bill was a student with us here at Macquarie University. He's actually done a fair bit of study with us at Macquarie, right through from a bachelor, master in management, a Master of Arts in Business Research, but today we are specifically interested in his time as a student doing the MBA here at Macquarie University. So passing over to you, Bill. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anna. And look, thank you to the school for inviting me here to be a part of the masterclass and the information session. I came to the MBA mid-career, really, but I'll tell you a little bit about my professional background. I'm into my 6th career. I was almost a lawyer. Then I taught secondary school for a number of years. Then I had executive positions in the financial services sector. Then I took on a role as a national marketing director for a top 3 non-profit. Then I started my own business and my own consulting practice. And now I'm president and CEO of Verunde, as Sienna mentioned. I was asked, and I found the MBA quite useful, if I could use a word that's in current usage, to be able to pivot into something new. So my half of my series of careers has accompanied my studying for and now holding the MBA. I was asked what skills I might have learned inside and outside the Macquarie classroom that I bring into my current role. And I took that to mean, what did I learn formally in the classroom, and what did I learn informally through interactions with my peers and faculty and the broader cohort. So I'd like to give you perhaps 8 items that I've taken from my time here and that influence my current role. The first is an enduring commitment to collaboration, teamwork, and respect for others. And those are things that you will find you need to bring to the MBA, particularly when you start to do your group work. One of the things that I learned during my MBA was to recognise the drivers that lead to working under pressure. And there are 3 that I manage reasonably well in my current position. But those 3 drivers for working under pressure are time, expectations, and execution. And so Steve mentioned the time commitment to the MBA. And there's no doubt that we all have a finite amount of time. The time that you spend now with your families, your relationships, your recreation, and your current job will be stretched even further when you're asked to devote time to your MBA study. And that will create pressures internally when you're doing the MBA as well. And it's about how you manage those pressures. The time to do the time to meet the deadlines around your individual assignments, to make contributions to group work and so on. All of those will stretch your available time. But learning to work with that time constraint, I think, helps us manage time constraints when we are in my own business anyway. The second one is expectations. You bring to the MBA your own expectations, but there are the expectations of others. There are expectations of people outside the university. So they are people, your friends, your family, your workmates, and so on. They have expectations of you during your MBA. Internally, there's another group of expectations from your peers that are doing the MBA. Everybody arrives doing an MBA full of goodwill, but also filled with a competitive fire. So those expectations of self and others also need to be managed and contextualised so that you're not working under too much pressure. And the final element of this final thing you need to recognise under when you're working under pressure is the capacity to flawlessly execute. And I need to flawlessly execute everything I do in my business every day. I don't succeed, but that's my goal. You will need to flawlessly execute in everything you do with your MBA. That's your presence in class. You won't get another crack. You won't get a second crack at your individual assignments. You won't get a second crack at your group assignments. You won't get a second crack at your examinations and so on. So part of the pressure that you're going to be working under is around the delivery of flawless execution. But it's a little different to being pulled in many different ways and being required to flawlessly execute in your current business. The third lesson I learned from doing my MBA was that I was not bulletproof, and I was not the owner of all of the good ideas. And one of the things that one learns fairly quickly when one starts an MBA, particularly at Macquarie, is that you can't be a wallflower or a snowflake, because if you are, then your lack of authenticity around being open to good ideas will fairly quickly pull you apart. And I think, again, in terms of my own business, I'm not bulletproof, and I don't own all of the good ideas. So I surround myself with people that can contribute to my thinking, and part of my thinking that I learned or became much more comfortable with through my MBA at Macquarie was learning to think outside the box and not be constrained by one discipline. When you do your MBA at Macquarie, it's like approaching the smorgasbord at the RSL. You get an opportunity to have a look at a whole range of different disciplines, and you can eat from many different bowls. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be an expert in any one of those disciplines for simply having done an MBA. What you will be very expert at is recognising how to pull those different disciplines together in relation to your own management and leadership role, running your own business and so on. And I think that's a key lesson for me in my current role. I learned to be confident enough to challenge my thinking and to be challenged. And there's a lot of challenge of thinking at your MBA. Again, not everybody's right about everything all the time. It's about being comfortable with discomfort. You know, you will be asked to do things in the MBA. You'll be asked to analyse things that you're unfamiliar with, to speak about things that you're not sure of, to present things that may or may not fit well within your realm of experience. But that's all part of being able to deal with the discomfort of being in business in any role at any particular time of day. I think what I learned massively from my time doing the MBA, and I've brought into my business, my current role and my roles even before, is the importance of looking out and caring for the things that are important. In my experience doing my MBA, I did not care enough about my key relationships. I decided to accelerate my progress through the MBA and get it done in 14 months. And that came at a huge, potentially huge cost to my relationships, my family, my friends, my workmates, and so on. And I was selfish in doing that. So one of the things that has prompted me to do is to pull back and question, am I being selfless or am I being selfish? as I move through my own current role. And I think if I'm being selfless, then I'm exposing, then I'm giving people time and care and nurture in the key relationships, both at business and at home. Now you'll also you'll get with the smorgasbord of subjects, you know, your strategy, your finance, your marketing, your accounting, your advertising, your HR. All of those things actually provide very important key learnings that you can take back into your leadership role, your management role, your own business, or whatever it is. And I find that those things still today, even though I'm somewhat now removed from the theory, still provide me with clues to be able to deal with today's problems. So I would invite you to think about, what can I bring apart from just the knowledge? How can I bring the application of that knowledge into my daily practice? And that's what I try. That's certainly what I try to do. The other question and a key learning for me from the Macquarie MBA. I was asked why Macquarie. Well, Sienna already acknowledged that I did my undergraduate degree there. I felt quite comfortable about going back. MGSM, as it then was, had a great brand, significant cachet, strong cachet in the business world, well regarded by recruiters, and it had a long and proud history in the way in which it had been operating. Now that has changed structurally to some extent, but I think what is very important is that I think my understanding and my experience of the school now is that it's very committed to maintaining the value in the brand, and therefore the value in the piece of paper that you take away, in the parchment that you take away at the end of your time here. In my due diligence in looking at the Macquarie MBA, I wanted to understand more about the faculty, and I found that there were three things. They were welcoming, they were experienced and practice-led, so they were able to make sense to me in a day-to-day way beyond the theoretical. And I had heard that they were great teachers. And in fact, in my time there, I had generally great teaching. There were a couple of duds, but I don't think that the duds are there. I know that the duds aren't there anymore. And great teaching has now been elevated back into the business school environment. And it's a wonderfully rich experience being taught by people who care about you, care about what where you're heading, and who are happy to be themselves, to be challenged and so on. I was drawn to the teaching methods, the face-to-face, the blocks, and the challenges of group work. I was particularly drawn by the diverse backgrounds of students and their employers. You know, the size and scale and the experience that people brought into the program was just amazing, an amazing gift when you to all who attended during my time. And then I think there's the breadth and the depth of the curriculum. You know, there are all of the usual offerings, although I see that there are some new subjects being introduced. I think if you go into the MBA looking for intellectual challenge, you may find it, you may not. But there are some gems in the subject offerings that will intellectually profoundly challenge you. And one of those is a subject I was speaking to Steve about earlier, Foundations of Management Thought. It's been taught at the business school for 35 years. It looks at management thinking through philosophy. It's very challenging. So look, I thank you for the opportunity to speak. I wish you well in your deliberations. And you are making a choice that will influence forever your professional lives and your careers and your personal lives. But I'd like to say that having been around the place for a fair bit of time now, be assured that the Macquarie MBA will not disappoint you. And good luck.
Thank you, Bill. Once again, incredibly insightful. And I mean, you have done so much study with us here at Macquarie, so I appreciate your perspective. Now, we don't have too much time for the Q&A, unfortunately, and we do have a lot of questions there. So I'm just going to pick a select few, which I think will be most valuable to all of the viewers. Now, First question is for you, Steve. You did mention that you could gain entry into the MBA through a graduate certificate or the graduate diploma at Macquarie. Now, someone has asked, in lieu of a bachelor's degree, would a graduate certificate or graduate diploma from another university satisfy the requirement?
We're going to have a close look at that in terms of recognition of prior learning, RPL. So we would look at that on a case-by-case basis. Okay. But otherwise, you could come into the grad cert without that bachelor's if you didn't have that, and if you didn't have a similar experience elsewhere or course achievement elsewhere, you can come straight in. So, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Next question. Now, I know you did touch on this, Steve, but I think because it is such a new and unfamiliar topic versus the 16-unit MBA here at Macquarie University, could you just quickly outline the key differences between the 1.5-year version and the 2-year version?
Sure, Sienna. And to be very clear, if you have 5 years managerial and professional work experience, 5 years, you're then eligible to apply for the 12-unit MBA, 1.5 years, 12-unit duration, which means you don't have to then go on and do an additional 4 elective units in what we call our flexible zone. So it's a straight 12-unit MBA, provided you have that 5 years. So we look at your application there carefully. A key part of your experience, and I think, Bill, you touched on this, is that you are working with a variety of middle to senior managers. So we do look very carefully to make sure you meet that criteria coming in. So if you have that 5 years, you're eligible for the 12-unit MBA. If you just have the 3 years managerial experience, then your entry is into the 16-unit MBA. Now, this is new, so we are getting those details organised on our website and available to you. And you can also book a one-to-one consultation. I think there's a link somewhere, Sienna.
Yes, I just sent it to all the attendees. So that's in the live chat function for those of you attending.
Great. Yes. So I hope that's clear, but we'll have those details set out.
Absolutely. Now, another quick question for you, Steve. Sorry to leave Bill and Jaco out of this, but can someone do MBA units from another university while in our MBA?
We do have some of that flexibility. We need to look at that again carefully to make sure that if, for example, you wanted to study overseas, perhaps part of an exchange program, we already have a number of relationships with overseas universities. Not that they're active at the moment with COVID-19. We look to get back to that. So yes, you can. We just need to look at the alignment between the unit learning objectives and the assessment to make sure it meets the standard in terms of the learning.
So a possibility. Fabulous. Now, last question, once again for you, Steve, just focusing on the MBA specifically. Someone's wanting to know about the internship work placements within the MBA. Now they're asking, are there internships? And I know that's correct, there are, but the student also wants to know, does the university help place students in these placements, or is it the student's responsibility to find their own placements?
There's probably a mix there. I think through internships, and we do have a number of corporate partnerships where we can place you in internships, and then an ongoing job can often emerge from that. So it's a mix, really. I wouldn't say we don't have a dedicated work placement program. A number of our students are already working, particularly our domestic students anyway. But it can happen in terms of our internship program. Often it just emerges that we have those relationships, and then from that a job can be forthcoming.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate that. And Bill and Jaco, thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of those at home tuning in, thank you for joining us today. Now, I know that there was a lot to process. So if you didn't absorb anything or you wanted to watch this back, we actually are going to send you the recording. So we'll be in touch via email on Friday with the link for the recording. So you're welcome to watch it again. And also I did send the link in the live chat function to book a personal consultation. Now, like I said, we covered a lot. And if we didn't get to your specific questions and you'd really like to discuss your personal situation, I really can't recommend a one-on-one enough. They're so valuable. And even if it only takes 5 minutes to iron out any confusion that you may have, it's something we'd love to do. So thank you again for joining us. And Bill, Steve and Jaco, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.